enjoyment, sustained happiness, eudaimonia, which is the Greek word. Eudaimonia. To achieve eudaimonia is the goal of human life, of all human life, and arguably perhaps the goal of all life. Sustained enjoyment. I was going to write it up here because I said it, so, all right. This is how it's usually spelled, I think. Eudaimonia. Eudaimonic experience is experience that is characterized by sustained enjoyment. So anyway, and you know the idea, and remember the wave, remember the surfer on the wave, right? The idea is that there are certain natural organizations of character traits that lead to personal excellence and happiness all at once, simultaneously. And that is a beautiful character, right? The character that has cultivated personal excellence is a beautiful character, and it has the same properties. I think Aristotle listed them as 3, and I'm not sure if I can remember all of them. But harmony or balance, I think, is one of them. Proportion. Anyway, there are these universal characteristics of beauty, according to the ancient Greeks, and that are manifest in beautiful characters as well as in beautiful phenomena in the natural world or in beautiful works of art. When we get to our lecture on virtue ethics at the end of the term, I'll catch up on all this. Anyway, so let's try to figure out what some of these other radical environmentalists are saying and how they end up adapting and changing these normative traditions. So let's just start with the group A conservationists. What would they, how would they tend to reason about what would their thinking consist of? When they contemplate this oil terminal at the port of Vancouver. Well, we know that they put a lot of emphasis on economic value, but they're also holists. All right, they belong over here. Conservationists. Pretty, I changed my view on that. In the old days, I used to say the classical Group A conservationists really are just straight out utilitarians, and they belong. But I've since concluded that really they're rule utilitarians, and once you become a rule utilitarian, you can be kind of a holist, right? Practically speaking, you can say that you want to make your resource management decisions on the basis of what's good for the whole, right? For the whole human community. Okay? Yeah, go ahead. Is it David? Robin, sorry.
Yeah. Group A, one of their biggest thing would be not only to maximize resources, but to prioritize not waste. Would that be a big thing for you?
Very big. And Pinchot was really big on eliminating waste.
So for them, it would be, I guess for the Group A, wouldn't they have been pushing more for the pipeline rather than this train line? And this train line is still going to be better than not, because there's going to be less waste, or it's more risk of waste than just not using stuff at all and just keeping it in North Dakota somewhere.
Yeah, the Group A's are going to have they're farther down those serpentine trails, aren't they? Yeah. Those darn Group A's. All right. Yeah, because they're much more. They make many more concessions to prudence, to prudential reasoning, to the kinds of concerns that you have. They're realists, right? Sober-eyed realists, you could say. But they're also holists, and they have to rely on the results of science.
So they're aware that it's bad, but they're still doing it anyways.
Yeah.
That's how very stupid.
Hypocrisy. Akrasia. This is a Greek word for paralysis of will. I think is weakness of will, and you could see that politically we suffer from this tremendous weakness of will, and that leads to profound cultural dissociative, right? Hypocrisy, right? And just we live in bad consciousness, don't we? And that's very stressful. We don't often acknowledge that. But we live in bad consciousness, don't we? The more aware you are of the routine things that we do, the more you realize that you're doing all kinds of things that are inconsistent with your understanding of your society's long-term good, and by implication, your own. Many of you are quite young and want to have families someday, and so, these are not so far in the future concerns, right? For a lot of us in this room, they're very immediate. They affect us in our lives immediately in the next few decades. Oh my goodness, don't do that. I had that damn thing turned off. Anyway, all right. So maybe the Group A sees, Robin is instructing us that maybe the Group A conservationists they're kind of on the fence, right? And we can recall that these dams in the Columbia River were built under the auspices of that old school conservationist thinking. But the fact that they're holists and the fact that they have to rely on science to make these long-term decisions, so anyway, it still seems to me they're going to be very suspicious, and they're going to be strongly inclined to reject this proposed oil terminal. And then so in along here we also have, of course, we have our other thinkers. We have Norton, and we have Wilson. And then up in here we start to have the more than anthropocentric thinkers. Of course, these are the neo-Humeans. All right, and then we've got these environmental virtue ethicists in here, and then we've got the neo-Kantians. This is Rolston and his whole crew, right? And then, did I leave anybody out? No. All right. So what happens to? You okay, Roy? Roy, come here, bud. Here, jump. Come here. That's a good boy. So what happens to? Remember, Norton's a pragmatist, but Norton's not my favorite environmental pragmatist, though. And in fact, I think metaphysically he does injustice. Metaethically, his analysis does injustice to. And ultimately, he's just going to say that the reasons for protecting ecological wholes, that we might as well just justify protection of ecological wholes on strictly anthropocentric, but holistic, long-term, right? Future generations and people on the other side of the earth, right? Whole Earth, spatially and temporally expanded, anthropocentric view. We might as well base all of our policies on that point of view. Long-term, whole Earth focused, right? All of humanity, not whole Earth, but all of humanity, right? And including future generations. And at that point, the policies that we recommend in Washington, D.C., right, are going to be identical. They're going to converge. The convergence hypothesis is associated with Norton. That's one of his big contributions. He says, look, man, and it's kind of true, right? He says, if you look at all the policy initiatives proposed by holistic anthropocentrists, they converge to the point of being indistinguishable from the policy initiatives proposed by the self-described not more than anthropocentrists, okay? So anyway, but Norton, I think he's a little bit lazy. He doesn't want to do. He's suspicious of all questionable metaphysical commitments, and so he has these blinders on, and he's not able to recognize that actually value in nature can be interpreted both subjectivistically and objectivistically. And this too is an experience, right? The experience of value in nature that Rolston describes is, Norton would just say, that's, nobody can actually experience that, right? He's just making all that stuff up because he's inventing this moral status in an ecological whole, and that's just a questionable metaphysical move, and I just don't want to make that kind of a move, right? But maybe there's something to the idea that our experience of value in the natural world is both objective and subjective. A good comparison is maybe our experience of our bodies, right? We experience our own bodies both subjectively and objectively. We experience ourselves as the subject of our own experience, right? But we also experience our bodies as objects, right? Especially when you get sick or when you get injured or something, you know, you end up experiencing your body as an object. So perhaps we can interpret our experience of value in natural resources the same way, right? Value in natural resources are both objectively real. Values in natural resources are both objectively real in the kind of ways that Rolston describes, but they're also always filtered through this anthropic framework that we as human beings have to filter them through, right? So, in any event, maybe in the final analysis there's not that much difference. Maybe Norton just doesn't want to make the kind of moves, but they're not necessarily closed off from a pragmatist point of view. And the pragmatists probably, you know, they're going to be like Thomas Birch. And the pragmatists are just going to be very suspicious of all these kinds of dichotomies and categorizations in here. And the pragmatists are much more inclined to view our experience of value in nature as being simultaneously value as a means and value as an ends. Okay? Means and ends in natural resources are always inextricably intertwined. And so to identify a value as an end in itself seems a little bit artificial in light of our own actual experience, right? We don't experience value in itself. It's in itself and it's also for something else, right? Salmon are a really good example of that, right? Salmon are commercially really valuable. The value of a salmon can be apprehended by any of these valuative baskets that we have attached onto our wheel, right? These are all, right? I haven't shown you guys a picture of a fish wheel yet. Maybe I should find one. But that's how I thought of putting this chart in a circular pattern, because I was looking at those old fish wheels from in the Columbia River. These things were very controversial. I'll talk more about them when I give my lecture on I don't know what that is. They still have a few fish wheels around. I think in Alaska they still use them. But let's try to get a picture of one on an old one on the Columbia River. Well, people still use them. Hey, look, he's got his Brandon Roy jersey on. Good job. Monster fish. Probably a white sturgeon, huh? Anyway, we don't want to get too distracted here. But see these fish wheels? I want to see one from the side. Damn it. You don't show one from the side. Let's go. How come I can't? I know I should look under. Believe me, I know this seems bizarre, right? But I'm making a point here. All right, 1880. Okay, that one's all right, I guess. Let's see if we can get an even better one. 1905. This might be one of the very controversial ones. All right, well, there you see it from the side. I mean, from the... This probably was right around, that looks like right around Celilo Falls, right there. So this was one of the fish wheels that caused all kinds of controversy. But they all caused controversy. They were indiscriminate. Well, I should lower the screen. But if we were looking at it from the side, okay, so it appears that what we're looking at here is... it's kind of hard to tell. This is probably taken in the 1940s or not. Oh, it says 1905. Okay, so this is long before any of the rivers changed at all. And around Celilo Falls there, the river kind of... So I'm not even sure whether we're looking at the Washington side or whether this is the Washington side and that's the Oregon side. But it appears that the current is going this way, right? Doesn't it? You guys are supposed to be an attentive audience. You know, it's just totally enraptured by this. Anyway, so these wheels, they spin, right? And the current moves them, all right? So let's put our current on the board here. Which way is the Willamette flowing? See, the Willamette's flowing that way, right? So the board doesn't matter. Anyway, let's say the river's flowing this way. That means the current, that means the wheel is, right? The wheel is spinning because the current is flowing this way. It's pushing the wheel in a clockwise to rotate in the clockwise. In which direction are the salmon swimming? Okay, so the current is going that way. And the salmon, of course, are swimming upstream. So what happens every time one of those little buckets goes underwater, right, and they sight them, and that photo shows you an ideal position. You don't know it because you don't see the rest of the river. But the salmon barons, like this was probably a fish wheel operated by either the Winans brothers cannery or the Seufert family cannery in the Dalles. And these people were very wealthy families who made millions of dollars, by harvesting the common resources of the people and then monopolizing those resources and destroying those resources. They were initially very, very adversely affected by overfishing in the ocean and in the river. But these wheels were incredibly efficient. There was one, in fact, it might have been this very one, but the record was 72,000 pounds of salmon in one day that these things would harvest. They would locate them on channels in the river where they knew the salmon would habitually and routinely and necessarily have to pass, right? Because of these conditions, all these whitewater conditions, right? Salmon like to go a certain way where it's easy, right? Or as easy as it's already hard enough. Anyway, so then these salmon barons would build these giant fish wheels, and guess what? A lot of these sites were what for indigenous fisher people? They were usual and accustomed places. In fact, that's where the salmon barons got the idea, right? Okay, we'll put it there, because we saw all those Indians, they fish there all the time. They know where the salmon go. Get them out of here, let's build a big fish wheel, right? And then they were challenged in court, and eventually these were outlawed, by the way. They were outlawed on the Oregon side, I think, in the 1920s, by voter initiative. Very interesting, by ballot initiative. And then on the Washington side of the river, they were outlawed in the 1930s. So, because they were so indiscriminate, right? They just caught everything. They strip mined our salmon runs, basically. And people finally had enough of them. But, so I got the idea, when I was looking at that fish wheel, I got the idea of putting my chart in a circular form, and then imagining, if you don't mind me getting a little cosmic on you, that's kind of why you take a philosophy class, right? Get a little cosmic, try to start thinking, wow, man. But, this is life, right? And we're in the middle. That's you, right? That's your little self, right? In the middle there. And the river of life is bringing all kinds of values to you, right? Some of the values are swimming upriver like the salmon. Some of the values maybe are being brought down from above, right? And they're going down in the current. But anyway, you have some control. Your culture has a lot of control too over how, but you have some control over this wheel, and think of every one of these perspectives as a lens and a different way of capturing the value of a natural resource, right? Different understanding of the value of a natural resource. And so depending on what factual circumstances you face, what kind of moral struggle you're trying to resolve, you'll exercise your reason, right, and your imagination, and you'll move this around to a few different perspectives, perhaps, maybe one main perspective, and you'll understand the moral struggle, right, from that perspective, depending on what it is, right? And then a lot of our moral struggles require us, of course, to move back and forth all over the place and be pluralists, radical pluralists, right? Because we always have to consider the human utilitarian, right? We can't just just say those guys are crazy. Maybe they are, but they have a lot of power, though. They have a big megaphone, right? And they can do a lot of stuff. So maybe they are crazy, but we better not treat them that way. We better think of them as being very serious people who are trying to accomplish something. And that means we have to try to reconstruct their argument and see how it makes sense, right? And it does. If you roam around in here and then slide on over to here, right? Grab some pincho, maybe, talk about, maybe, and find some set of empirical observations that you can hang your hat on. And next thing you know, you've got a pretty good explanation for why we ought to build this oil terminal, right? But you're going to include both individualistic anthropocentric perspectives, and you're going to include holistic anthropocentric perspectives, okay? So, all right, so what happens to utilitarianism when it becomes conservationism? First of all, it gives up its classical individualistic orientation. It becomes necessarily some form of rule utilitarianism. All right? Conservationism is a form of rule utilitarianism. And then once we get farther and farther away from emphasizing economic values, right? The group A conservationist tends to emphasize economic values, right? But he also emphasizes that those economic values are embedded in an ecological whole. So perhaps it's very difficult, even from a group A conservationist point of view, to defend this oil terminal. I would submit it probably is very difficult to defend it from a group A conservationist point of view. And then the group Bs, of course, are they tend to emphasize aesthetic values, scientific values, recreation values, right? They tend to give a lot more credibility to non-economic aspects of value in natural resources, right? So, for example, the forester, the group B forester, manages the forest as an ecological whole because he or she recognizes that the forest does all kinds of ecosystem services. It provides habitat for all kinds of animals and plants whose value we don't yet know about. A library of unread books, all that sort of thing. So the group B guy tends to emphasize non-economic considerations far more than the group A conservationist does. And then, of course, Norton also is a very good example of a group B, right? And then Wilson gets us a little more exotic because he wants to start talking about biophilia, right? And so that kind of just deepens anthropocentrism even more, right? Okay, so that's what happens to utilitarian. These guys are all very strongly inspired and committed to the utilitarian normative traditions, all right? Specifically the rule utilitarian. And they have very little, Wilson and Norton would have very little involvement. They would find these kinds of arguments to be just not very helpful and kind of worthless because they had too many metaphysical, right? All this metaphysical status stuff, let's just stick with what we know. Let's be good scientists and let's draw all the dots together. Let's recognize that we're all embodied and we're all interrelated. And once we recognize those two facts and are properly schooled up by ecologists and biologists about what that means, right? To be embodied and to be related. Once we're properly schooled up by scientists on what it means to be embodied and to be related, then we have ample resources to put together a very strong argument, right? Just based on future human consequences. We just know too damn much about the effects of our actions on the ecology. We do. And we don't want to fall into the pathetic position of being science deniers, right? That's where too many people are going, and it's just sad. I mean, the loudmouths on the right wing, the corporate media, it's kind of pathetic to watch people flopping around in denial of science. It's just, so we don't want to go there, right? So let's, kind of pay attention to what the ecologists are telling us, and let's perhaps employ a precautionary principle. Let's just assume that maybe there is moral status in non-human entities, right? And let's not do something until we know for sure that it doesn't harm those non-human entities. A lot of just recklessness, right? In Europe, in the United States, what we do, the chemicals, oh man, want to be depressed, go, especially if you're a person who wants to have children someday, especially if you're a childbearing human, a female, it can be very discouraging. But you test the chemicals in your body, it's not good. And there's an argument right there, right? We're embodied and we're interrelated. We're doing things and we probably should do what Europe has done for a long time now, which is to adopt the precautionary principle, which says that you cannot allow a chemical into the environment until you have proven that it does not harm human beings. Here, we do the opposite, right? We say, chemicals, okay, man, we're all in favor of chemicals, but When one of them is proven to harm humans, then we'll get rid of it, right? But until then, so anyway, and we could, in a way, maybe what Thomas Birch is saying is that we ought to adopt something like that precautionary principle when it comes to our moral understanding about anything, right? About anything at all. Whether it's a highly advanced robot, a virus, an embryo, a human embryo, a pregnant thylacine, all kinds of bizarre, exotic entities we could think about and ask, well, and Birch says the first step when we start thinking about the moral status of any of those entities, the first step is to give it some consideration to begin with, right? To pay attention to it. Like, I don't know, maybe I date myself, but the example of the robot, of this super, the super sophisticated robot who's so sophisticated that it has feelings and it is rational to such an extent that it's also autonomous, right? And then of course you take a philosophy and science fiction class and you study, a scenario like that, and then you ask yourself, does that robot, that super advanced robot, have moral status? Those are the kinds of questions we're also asking about ecological wholes, right? But Birch's point is that in order to even begin to think about whether something is deserving of moral consideration, we have to be open to it. We have to invite it to show us in what sense it might be morally considerable, right? Like the rocks in the fumaroles at the edge of Lake Superior, right? If we just import Rolston, I even asked Rolston this. One of my students many years ago wondered if a rock, according to Rolston, had intrinsic value. And so I'll ask him, and I sent him an email. And it took him a while to answer, and he apologized. He was very polite. He said, I'm sorry I didn't answer. I didn't see your email. But anyway, he answered. He said, no, rock doesn't have any moral status. Nope. Because there's no storied achievement in a rock, right? Now, a rock might be part of the storied achievement of an ecosystem, and then it's going to have something like, it's going to be part of, I guess, a very small, but there's meaning there too. Anyway, but for Birch, the question of moral status needs to be thrown out, and what we need to be thinking about instead is we need to start changing our cultural understanding of obligation to non-human entities. And the only way to do that is to start by being open to them and start by assuming that they have moral considerability, that they deserve moral consideration. Like the rock, right? And then once we think about it, if you're there and you see that rock is playing a certain role in the ecosystem, then all of a sudden the rock too has moral status, right? And it doesn't matter whether or not it has storied achievement or whether or not it has a telos, right? It's connected to something that has a telos probably, and so that's enough. Anyway, but this business of trying to separate out the essential reason for the value and then all the other aspects of the value, of the experience of value, Birch says, let's just stop doing that. Because that's an artificial move, and it's really a move that's just inspired by 2,000 years of academic philosophy, of increasingly abstract and isolated from the real world academic philosophy, right? The pragmatists are pretty critical of academic philosophy, which I appreciate. And not just the pragmatists, but the feminists are also, and some of the other, the 20th century continental thinkers. Anyway, so we're trying to inaugurate a new era in moral reasoning by returning to experience, by paying close attention to what is actually going on. And then we begin to learn that our real task as environmental philosophers is not to articulate and defend some notion of moral status, which is how Rolston views his job, right? But to show how all these so-called human-centered values that we identify up in through here are interrelated, because we are embodied and interrelated. These human-centered values are embodied and interrelated across the entire wheel, okay? And it turns out that all of these boundaries are porous. In fact, it turns out that this whole chart is just going to be not very useful anymore, because now it just helps us, right? It helps us understand the different elements of value in nature, right? this is we have now concluded the metaethics portion of our journey, right? And now we're going to start looking at specific instantiations, specific examples of environmental ethics, of whole environmental ethics. Like, we've looked a little bit at environmental pragmatism. That's a good example of what but we're going to look at deep ecology and social ecology and ecofeminism and virtue ethics, right? As whole systems. And all of them, by the way, including environmental pragmatism too, they all challenge these traditional metaphysical categories, okay? So the basic approach, like what Birch offers us, is to just be suspicious of the distinction between anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric to begin with. Be suspicious of it, and be suspicious of all these categories. And realize that, these all reflect different kinds of experiences of value, all right? Anyway, and in the end, perhaps, we're given, maybe that's why I decided to hold off on virtue ethics until the very end, because in the end, perhaps, what our task is not to identify any action norms, but to identify how we can lead lives of personal excellence by honoring each of these kinds of experience of value, each of these different kinds of experiences that we have when we contemplate natural resources. Robin.
So the Group B conservationists, if we're talking about the river, we're talking about the consequences of the river, they would be more concerned with the fact that there is a potential of a massive spill and disaster that would damage the river, compared to, if we go farther on that chart, those who think the river has intrinsic value within itself.
That's right, yeah.
So the Group B would be more concerned about damaging the river for the value of people.
Sure.
They're interested with anthropocentric. Right?
Ripping up rather than continuing to disintegrate and destabilize the ecosystem by inviting more environmental calamity. We ought to be doing the opposite, start restoring the integrity and stability of the lower Snake in particular by ripping those dams out of there and allowing the flow regime to return to something. That's basically it. The juvenile salmon, they got it. They're on a schedule, man. They need that flow rate. They need that water flowing at the rate that it flowed in when they evolved. It's a no-brainer. Yeah, go ahead.
But it's not because the river and its ecosystem as a whole, and the river itself is valuable.
The river in itself is not valuable from a conservationist point of view. The way I teach conservationism, it ends at holistic anthropocentrism, right?
Right.
And then that's when you start going out into the wild, exotic lands off the reservation, right? But yeah, then think of their rejection of the notion that the salmon ecosystem has intrinsic value, or that the salmon have intrinsic value to the ecosystem. Their rejection of that, their rejection of the notion that things up here have moral status, is just the result of their extreme suspicion of questionable metaphysical commitments. Those are things we just can't know, right? Whereas we can know that human beings have interests that need to be met, right? And those interests include healthy bodies. And to have healthy bodies, you need healthy environments, healthy land, air, water, wildlife. Yeah. But these guys, of course, remember the refrain from Rolston. He's just saying, man, all